In this lesson, we're going to look at how to respond to changes in orientation. A mobile device is truly mobile, and a user can change the orientation of the device with the flick of a wrist. A lot of our applications have been optimized for portrait mode, and if you flipped your wrist and turned it into landscape mode, you'd see a number of them don't look quite right. For example, we have typically used a vertical layout that has a lot of controls that have fill parent for their width. Well, that may make sense. We're portrait mode, but it will make an awfully wide text box or a very wide button in landscape mode, so it may not be appropriate. So we would like to change the layouts, or at least change the widths of the controls. Conveniently, Android allows us to do both. So we'll take a look at both of those methods. One provides different resources for both portrait and landscape layout, and another allows us to respond to orientation changes in code. Our application has a simple text view and the pie chart that we've spent a number of lessons developing. And this is how it looks in portrait. And if I change that view to landscape, you can see that might not look so good. The good news is that Android allows us to fix that really easily. So this is our layout in the layout folder on the main layout, which is the way we've done it throughout this course. But I've also added another folder called layout-land and another main layout. Layout-land will be used automatically when the device switches into landscape mode. So we don't have to write any code, all we have to do is create another layout, which is what I've done. And if I take a look at this layout in landscape, you can see that I've got a text view over to the side and the pie chart. And that's perhaps a little bit better. It at least has the pie chart in roughly a square area, and the label fills a more reasonable amount of space. Now, if you have sharp eyes, you'll note that this is actually main L, and that's just for demonstration purposes. This main.axml in the layout land folder is exactly the same as main L, but in a little bit of a quirk in Mono, we have a little bit of trouble showing it to you. So you can develop the layout in the layout folder and work with it in the designer, and then move it over into layout land. The important thing is it does have to have the same name, or else the switch will not happen automatically. So this is, of course, one of those ones that's really tough to show you in an emulator. So when you get the work files, you'll have to run it on a device and take a look and see how that works. Now there's a second method that we can use to do this kind of thing in code. This method, using resources, requires us to have two layouts for every screen. And that may not be appropriate if all we want to do is make a subtle change. So here's another way of doing it. The first thing we have to do is add an attribute for configuration changes and set that to orientation. What this means is the activity is going to handle changes in orientation, and that the layout landscape should not be used when the orientation changes. So in this case, we're going to have to handle any orientation changes completely in code. There is a single override called onConfigurationChanged, which passes in a new config, and the new config tells us what the orientation is, whether it's portrait or landscape. So for this exercise, all I wanted to do was change the width of the pie chart. In portrait, the the width was 500, and that was basically the full screen. In landscape, I only want it to be about half the screen because it will get too tall for a landscape mode if I set that width any wider than that. So, all I do is set the width to 300. I don't have to invalidate the pie chart view because that happens automatically on an on-configuration changed. So those are two different ways of handling orientation changes. It's important to test your applications in both portrait and landscape orientations to make sure that your UI still makes sense to your user. And then you can use one of the techniques that we've shown you to make any changes that are necessary.